So here we are, AMD Zen 3 Ryzen 5000. It's here. If you've been living underneath a rock and you so happen to have missed the Thursday keynote, I'm going to go over some of the specs quickly here in this vlog and also talk about a potential upgrade path or upgrade future that I plan to take for myself in terms for a editing rig and a gaming rig. So let's talk about it. But if this is your first time to the channel and you want to learn more about building PCs and other gaming related stuff, click the subscribe button and notification bell so you don't miss a thing. What's happening, YouTube and the internet? Terrence here. We are back inside the lab, and like I mentioned in the beginning of this video, I'm going to quickly go over the specs for the recently announced AMD Ryzen 5000 on the new Zen 3 microarchitecture, starting with the Ryzen 9 5950X. It has 16 cores and 32 threads, a max boost clock frequency of up to 4.9 gigahertz. Wow. And then a base clock frequency of 3.4 gigahertz, all on a TDP of 105 watts, which I am going to elaborate on this a little bit further in this video. But all of the higher end Ryzen 5000 SKUs, from the 5950X to the 5900X to the 5800X, all have the same TDP, but they all don't have the same amount of cores. So, and then speaking of the AMD Ryzen 9 5900X, that has 12 cores, 24 threads, a max boost clock of up to 4.8 gigahertz, and a base clock frequency of 3.7 gigahertz. And that again has a TDP of up to 105 watts. And then an AMD Ryzen 7, the 5800X, has 8 cores and 16 threads, and a max clock speed of up to 4.7 gigahertz, and a base clock frequency of 3.8 gigahertz. That too with the 105 watt TDP. And then the Ryzen 5 5600X, which is a 6-core 12-thread CPU with a max boost clock frequency of up to 4.6 gigahertz and a base clock frequency of 3.7 gigahertz and a TDP of only 65 watts. And then AMD has increased the price of each of these CPUs, and general consensus amongst the community are some people are a little bit upset that AMD upped the prices up to $50, but I'm going to tell you that I think it's well worth the $50 price increase with the 19% IPC uplift that AMD is telling us in their benchmarks, along with the 26% generational performance increase from Zen 2. So I'm looking at the possibility of going with a mini ITX build. And a case that I have here in the lab that I've been really wanting to do a build in. Now could be the perfect time, especially with the name for the system. And I do plan on documenting that build. So be sure, if you're not subscribed to the channel yet, be sure to subscribe with the notification bell so you can catch that video the moment it drops. But I am looking at doing an X570 mini ITX build with a 5800X, and this would be for a dedicated gaming rig at 2560 by 1440p and at least 144 hertz. And as far as the GPU I would pair with that really depends on, how RDNA 2 Big Navi, how their higher end GPUs look and how they compare to the RTX 3070, because although I am skeptic of the availability in terms of just supply, I really have my eyes set on that graphics card as far as for a budget option and for 1440 for higher resolution gaming. Although I have other graphics cards that can handle the task, I also want to test this out for not only myself but for you guys and girls as well. Now, which mini ITX motherboard that I'll go with, I'm really not sure. But on the subject of motherboards, Asus has announced new B450 motherboards. On top of that, 2 more X570 motherboards, and then 1 new B550 motherboard, the Tough Gaming X570 Pro and the Crosshair 7 Dark Hero, and then a ROG Strix B550 XE. Now, I also do want to mention that AMD, and I have my beliefs on why this is the case, but AMD has gone on record to say that we won't see Zen 3 BIOS updates for the 400 series chipsets until January of 2021. So that tells me AMD wants to allow their motherboard partners to, all sell or get rid of their 500 series stock first before opening up Zen 3 on the older 400 series chipsets, because while it's not really a long time between now and January, but that's still very much subject to change. And from some of the early reports that I found, the BIOS updates for Zen 3 are only going to be available on select few motherboards. So that's important to note as well. On top of that, once you update your 400 series chipset, once you update the BIOS to a microcode that supports Zen 3, you will lose the backwards compatibility for that motherboard. So that is something you should strongly take into consideration if you do have a 400 series chipset and you're, say, on a Ryzen, a Zen Plus or a Zen 2 CPU. That's something to strongly consider if either you should sell your X400 series chipset motherboard and your CPU and just go all in with Zen 3 and a 500 series chipset. That way you will have all of the advantages like PCIe 4.0 and among other things on Zen 3 that you wouldn't on a X400 series chipset and a Zen 3 CPU. And that's why it's in my honest opinion that if you're coming from an older generation like a DDR3 platform and you want to come onto a newer DDR4 platform and your budget, say, isn't as high to entertain Zen Plus or Zen 2, right, and even Zen 3 CPUs, and you want to come on board and, say, start off with like a 1600 or an 1800X, something to that extent, I highly recommend that you stay on the 300 series chipset and the 400 series chipset for like Zen 1 to Zen Plus CPUs, and then the 500 series chipset, the 400 series chipset and 500 series chipset for like Zen 2 and Zen 3 CPUs. And then there's Intel's 11th gen Rocket Lake. It's coming with PCIe 4.0. Finally, they're a little late to the party, but it's also going to be on a new microarchitecture codenamed Willow Cove. And this is important because it's a newer architecture since Skylake, and although it's still built on the 14 nanometer process, Intel is looking to squeeze out more IPC, better boost clocks, and on top of that, they're giving us PCIe 4.0. And it's scheduled to come in the first quarter of 2021, sometime around March, but that could change given the climate and what's going on around the globe right now. That could very much change, and so it's a platform that I'm considering jumping on with the presumably named Z590 chipset. And regardless if Intel's upcoming 11th gen Rocket Lake CPUs are supported by the 400 series chipset, I still would prefer to switch to a 500 series chipset motherboard. Just in that way I can get any newer technologies that may come along with the chipset. AMD still may very much hold the crown in terms of price to performance, but I do use Adobe Premiere for my editing rig, so I would much rather prefer to stay on an Intel platform. But for a dedicated gaming rig, AMD may offer more value, especially being as I game at a higher resolution. And now for an upgrade path for myself, I think I've slowly come to the consideration of a Zen 3 X570 configuration for, say, a high-end gaming rig at 2560 by 1440p, and then upgrading from my 8700K to, or I say upgrade to from my 8700K to a 9900K, staying on the Z390 chipset I have, right, and waiting for 11th gen Rocket Lake, and then upgrading the motherboard and CPU altogether, right? Because I'm going to skip over 10th gen. I just couldn't see myself. I don't need 10 cores for a hybrid system, right? For an editing and gaming rig. Like, I just don't need 10 cores. I'm comfortable with somewhere along the lines of like an 8-core 16-thread CPU. I could go with a 10700K, but again, like I mentioned earlier in this video, I much rather stick to a platform to where I don't have to upgrade right now, or I don't have to upgrade the motherboard right now, and I can do that with my Z390 motherboard, or wait out the storm and upgrade both of them together. New CPU, new Intel CPU, new Intel chipset with 11th gen Rocket Lake. Plus, I also do enjoy overclocking. I haven't done any content involved with overclocking Intel CPUs, but we have done a few videos with like overclocking a GTX 1650 Super. I'll throw a link up to that card here so you can give that video a watch after watching this one, because even with a manual overclock, even on a CPU, right? But even with a manual overclock, you can get a slight boost in performance in both your content creation workflow and also on top of gaming, maybe even better 1% lows and minimums. Either way, I'm going to get my hands on a Zen 3 SKU or 2 and test this out on some of the older 400 series chipsets, whichever ones receive, compatible BIOS updates. On top of that, also test the relevancy of Zen, Zen Plus, and even Zen 2 going forward, and get the most out of a 9th gen 8 core, being as I still very much encode my video at 1080p and I game at a higher resolution. But you may not, and that's why we plan to test all of these CPUs and more in different configurations going forward in the new year. And for more PC tech tips and tricks, watch the top playlist first and the bottom one next. Consider joining our community by tapping the round subscribe icon down there at the bottom. And with that said, I'm gonna go ahead and go. Thanks for giving this one a watch. I hope to catch you on the next one. So until then, be easy.